Oh, it did start recording. I'm gonna.
And welcome everybody. I see that we have quite a few participants, and our registration noted that you all are from quite a few different agencies, researchers, industries, and we're really happy to have you today. So as Kirsten mentioned, we did have another event, and unfortunately we were Zoom bombed and lost quite a bit of our audience. So the purpose of today is really to have that audience engagement about the material that we were able to present on November 18th. Kirsten is going to upload the link to that webinar, and it runs just under 2 hours. So there's quite a bit of information about the Florida food system generally and the impacts of COVID-19 there, and we encourage you to watch that for additional details beyond what you'll hear today. But what we wanted to do is present information about several efforts that we have going on within UF-IFAS, as well as with collaborators at Florida Gulf Coast University on documenting the effects of COVID-19 on Florida's food system and moving us towards a more resilient future were we ever to encounter a situation like this again. Today's panelists, just to give you all a little bit of extra information, you'll only hear from me here at the beginning, but we have several people that are able to answer questions and engage with the audience. We've got 7 panelists, each from UF-IFAS and Florida Gulf Coast University, and I'm not going to read all of the details, but I do want to direct your attention here, and I believe that Kirsten is going to provide a photo of this at the end. As she said, if you are able to include the specific industry, specific commodity, or the panelist that you would like to direct a question to, that will be really helpful. If you don't, you're not unsure, we will figure it out on our end as well. So just very brief background on Florida's food system. If anyone is not familiar, growers and fishers in Florida literally produce the A to Z of commodity production. It's estimated that we produce 200 to 300 different commodities across different agricultural commodities, different marine commodities, as well as forest products. And some form of agriculture is present in every single county in the state. So the food system is also an important contributor to the state economy. If we think about the 3 different sectors, just production of food alone is roughly $10 billion in annual sales and directly supporting 137,000 plus jobs in the state. If we look at food processing and food related manufacturing, that's an additional $31 billion in sales and 76,000 plus jobs. And in food distribution, so wholesale and retail distribution, there's an additional $101 billion in sales and 1.2 million jobs. So we can think of getting everything from the farm all the way to these distribution channels, both at home and away from home. So, we're all somewhat familiar at this point, but when COVID-19 hit, the food service industry demand was particularly impacted, and that was quite important here in the state of Florida. So in 2018, it was estimated that 54% of food money was spent on food consumed away from home. So the effect of social distancing and stay-at-home orders meant that demand for food in places like theme parks, cruise ships, hotels, schools, and universities dropped dramatically in that March, April, May period. And a large portion of Florida's produce production goes into these hospitality and food service industries. So as an example along the way, we learned that tomatoes alone, roughly 80% of Florida's tomato production goes into this hospitality and food service industry. So this caused a major disruption to the food system in Florida. One initial effort that we had here at the Economic Impact Analysis Program was to estimate losses in sales revenue. So we had very good participation from producers across the entire food system on, reporting what was happening to the demand for their particular commodity. And we were able to estimate losses in sales revenues from this March to mid-May period when we had an initial survey out. So if we look across all of the different commodity types that were covered there, we were able to look at data we have on the average annual sales revenues for these commodity groups. We have estimates of, what portion of that annual revenue typically takes place in this March to mid-May period that we were looking at, and to determine the output at risk or the sales revenue that was at risk in this period. And then taking information from the survey, looking at the percentage losses with a 90% confidence interval to see, what were those estimated losses. And it was nearly $900 million in Florida production alone that was lost in this March to mid-May period. So, one of the things that we did, we had collaborators at Florida Gulf Coast University reached out to say, what else can we do? And all of us are quite passionate about the food system and having, no funding, but we're sitting around in our offices saying, what else can we do for the state, or what else can we do for these industries that we studied quite a bit? And we started to think, numbers are great, and they tell us one part of the story, but really collecting stories behind the data was really important, especially when we were in a situation that none of us in our lifetimes had experienced before. So we actually got a team of 26 researchers and agents from UF-IFAS across several different programs and departments. And there were 7 faculty members at Florida Gulf Coast University, again, from several departments, that were able to put together and start interviewing stakeholders across the entire food system. So again, from input supply to production, all the way to these distribution channels. The sectors that we covered in that November 18th webinar that you have the link to are input supply operations, production agriculture. There were several different commodities that we were able to cover, including citrus production, citrus packing and juice processing, commercial vegetables, cattle, and dairy. We were able to cover what was going on with small agriculture operations, as well as logistics and food nonprofits and school food services. And finally, financial, land appraisal, and insurance sector. And when I say we covered them in the November 18th webinar, we call these initial impressions. So we're collecting this data, but it really matters, who we've been able to talk to so far that is informing these initial impressions, and we have not yet gotten to the data analysis step. Sectors that were not covered in the November 18th webinar, several other sectors of production agriculture. The reason that these haven't been included yet are just that we haven't conducted enough interviews in these areas. One hope that we have of having this engagement with the stakeholders is to drive up some interest. And so if anyone is on the line today that is a member of one of these groups, whether we've covered it or not covered it yet, or knows people that are, please send them our way. We'll make sure that our contact information is there at the end in the chat box, and we would love to hear from them. So another sector is marine related food industry. So we do have a team from Florida Sea Grant that's interviewing aquaculture operators, seafood dependent restaurants, and also some seafood processors. The food wholesale and retail distribution is another sector that we would really like to get more interviews from. And then things like community gardens or cottage food operations. So we like to think about collecting information from these large stakeholders or big operations, but several people have their livelihood dependent on something like a community garden or a cottage food operation. And we want to make sure that we're including those stories as well. Finally, agriculture-related industry associations and government agencies. We have started those interviews as well, because we do think that the stories of everyone moving to the virtual format, or perhaps building new partnerships and new relationships throughout this effort, are just as important. So next steps, we're going to continue doing these surveys and interviews to look at, what are the lasting impacts of this scenario. So what we heard from producers or other stakeholders throughout the food system when we first started this effort several months ago might be very different than what we hear from them if we went back right now. So we're interested in picking up that change in what was going on over time. I mentioned before a data analysis step. Dr. Sebastian Galindo is heading up that effort, and we will be doing qualitative analysis on all of the interviews that we are collecting. And I would say that in just a few months was when that will get underway. And again, you can go back to that November 18th webinar and he will have some information there. Developing tools and practices for the future, so how can we use this information later? And just new efforts and partnerships. So one partnership that we plan to put in place soon, we have partners from Florida A&M University that are going to come online and begin doing some of these interviews. And we're starting to put in proposals and get some larger funded projects that will extend that quantitative survey effort that you saw at the beginning. So we will be coming back to stakeholders in January as part of a project that's funded by the USDA. And, we were a little bit concerned when we didn't get very good response rates the second times, but in the second round, but we totally understand that everyone is busy. We all have 10,000 things going on with COVID-19, and a little bit of survey fatigue was setting in. But with that, I think I will, I want to say thanks to the team. I mentioned we had quite a large team earlier in the beginning, and I will highlight those that are with us today and really just open it up to the Q&A session.
As a reminder, everybody, if you have any questions, you can either type it into the question and answer box, and we will answer those as they come in. Or you may also hit the raise hand button, which I think you should all have. I do not have that view, so I am hoping that you all do have that access, and I can give you the ability to ask your question verbally. Give everybody a minute in case they're actually typing in questions.
Christian, this is Fritz. I noticed, I believe it was Sarah mentioned something about agritourism. And that's a good point. And with Gene on the line, he can speak to that because he runs a lot of tours.
That is very true.
I mean, what I'll say is that from a teaching standpoint, it's hard to put a number to it, but it's a huge loss because we were relying on visiting farms and doing farm tours for our students. And that's this last semester in the spring, we got in 2 or 3, but then we stopped. And then this semester, none at all. So it's a huge loss in our teaching program. But in terms of, I know from county offices, it's a big moneymaker too. So there's a financial impact on that as well as, I guess, a promotional side of what we're doing in agriculture.
This is Gene McAvoy. I concur with Fritz. Hendry County in particular does a lot of ag awareness. We partner with Collier County, and we've had to cancel all our tours in the past year. And for us in Hendry County, that typically is what supports our 4-H program, is the revenues that we derive from our ag awareness program.
Very good. Krista, there is a question for you in the chat. How many people has UF-IFAS Extension interviewed thus far for the anecdotal information, and when do you expect to complete that part of this?
So I don't have the exact number in front of me, but I think that what we've completed so far is between 80 and 100 interviews. Again, we haven't necessarily analyzed them as a core group, and have just shared our initial impressions from everything that we've heard so far. But our goal was to get to 225. And again, I've pointed out some of the places where we were particularly lacking. There's several commodity groups that we haven't heard from within that production agriculture sector, and also that retail group. We'd really like to hear some more about what's going on in the grocery chains or what was going on in additional packing houses and wholesale distributors. When we're going to complete that part of this. So again, like I said, this is not necessarily tied to a funded project, and we're learning as we go initially we wanted to wrap up a couple months ago, but we're learning as we go that we learn new things over time and the situation is actually evolving. So I would say that we're definitely going to go through the month of January. And it might even extend beyond that if we find that we're learning new things.
I'm curious if there's any thought toward in the future, will there be a need to go back to some of these same folks if they, as the situation, like you said, evolves? Will these industries have different impacts as we move forward?
Yeah, it's certainly possible. So that's one of the things that we're going to try to find out in this the new project funded by the USDA. And again, it will go back to that quantitative survey as opposed to necessarily these in-depth interviews. But we'll be asking the same operations, what was going on in the first half of the year versus what was going on in the second half of the year, and try to pick up on that seasonality, season change. Agriculture especially is seasonal in nature. So, a lot of the fresh fruit and vegetable crops were hit hard because they were at peak season when the shutdown began in March, April. So I think that now if I asked them and interviewed them about what was going on in April, they would have a very different answer if I went back to the same producer right now.
Kristen,
I'm sorry, go ahead, Gene.
if I might add, this is a really fluid situation that we're facing with COVID, especially now with all these spikes that we're seeing around the country. A month ago, when I was talking to growers, they were saying it was business as usual. And now I'm starting to hear that we're seeing some shrinkage in demand and some crops are having difficulty being sold at this point. And that's liable to get worse. One thing that's made it, maybe that's helped the situation a little bit, is we had some really bad weather in October and November, which shrunk the supply side on the vegetable crop. So that maybe helped reduce the supply versus the demand. But I'm hearing growers now that Mexico's starting to crank up and ship product back to the United States. It's getting tight on some of the commodities.
Let me chime in with labor as well. In our interviews back in July and August, we heard a lot of concern about farm labor, especially from the larger operations, and there's kind of a wait and see attitude. So now we're at the point where many of our guest workers from Mexico mainly are starting to come back in. So I guess it's still a good time to keep interviewing people to see how that situation is unfolding.
We have a question coming from someone who wants to ask it out loud. So Jim Birch, you will now be able to unmute yourself.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, thank you, Kirsten, for introducing me. First of all, I want to say thanks to everybody that's involved in this meeting, because the idea of putting everybody together as a team is really the only way it works. But the question I have is somebody that alluded a little while ago to the, to some of the things that were happening within the agricultural community. And a lot of that was due to the fact of the coordination between shipping and with perishable vegetables and things like that. And so on the same broadcast, I was seeing places like St. Matthew's House, who I think does a tremendous job in trying to distribute food. Does this, and this may sound like a silly question, but this entire food supply thing that we're dealing with and we're talking about now, does this deal with that that urgency? We still have, I mean, any day you could pick and you could see cars lined up forever to try and to feed families. Does this, can we deal with that in conjunction with all these other things that we're dealing with in this whole thing, in this team thing that you're doing now?
Thank you for the question, Jim. I believe Catherine might be the one to answer this question.
Yeah, thanks. I can say a few words. It seems like Jim's question actually had to do with the sort of whole span of the food system. So maybe I know some of Jean's efforts had to do with the production side, but I can say that the food banks have seen really dramatic increases in demand, as you mentioned, Jim. Some of them in our interviews mentioned up to a 500% increase in demand. And the good thing is through the CARES Act and then donations from people in the community, they've also seen increased funding, which has enabled them to help meet that demand. But as you mentioned, there's still a lot of work to be done and a lot of people that are still relying on those food banks.
I would also add, Catherine, that Farm Share, which is an umbrella organization of food banks in the state of Florida, they have received federal dollars and they are actually buying large amounts direct from growers right now. And I've had reports from growers saying that has been a big help to them, especially in those that are having trouble moving some of their commodities. Also, the food box program is, even though there's only been, a relatively small number of contracts awarded, those people that have the contracts, which are a few hundred across the country, they're buying from a lot of their, neighbor farms and others. So that's been a big help, especially a few months ago. Now, most of that money for food boxes dried up right now. And hopefully if there's a new COVID program that is funded, that will pick up again.
Jean, while we're on this topic, we have a question that sounds like you somewhat covered, but I think David can also chime in. So during the pandemic in South Florida, some farmers opened up sales direct to consumers, as you were talking about, drive-through produce boxes for the first time. Was this something that happened elsewhere in Florida? And do you expect this new channel to continue in the future?
Yeah, it actually happened all over the state of Florida, Kristen. I worked with Farm Bureau and Department of Agriculture, and both of them put together lists of farms that were willing to sell direct to the public. They were advertised all over social media, and it was a help, but the volumes, especially for the larger commercial growers, just don't match with what the food service takes up from the industry. I had one grower that he was doing direct sales, and he had lines of cars that stretched for miles all day long on the days he was open. But at the end of the day, he might have only sold 30 or 40,000 pounds of vegetables, where in a typical day he would ship 10 semis, which are 35,000 pounds each. So it's a help, but it's not going to substitute for what our industry services right now.
David, did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, thank you, Kristen. Yeah, it's a great question. A lot of small farmers made decisions during the pandemic that they had been considering a long time. And I think the CSA model is something that a lot of smaller farmers had considered, but never had really adapted as another revenue stream. And I think a lot of them, now that they've kind of crossed that bridge, will continue that extra revenue stream. We're seeing that quite common in a lot of communities. And it also raised awareness within their own communities of their presence and helped to develop some inertia around local food.
Someone has a question about what will you be doing with all of these interviews? Publishing research, reporting back to the USDA?
I'd say any and all of the above. Obviously, we want to get some research outputs from this, but primarily we're just trying to provide information to inform decision making on how we best make it out of this situation, whether that looks something like going back to what we were used to or what we might call normal prior to the pandemic, or do we identify some things that might be priorities for making the food system more resilient or making some changes as we come out of this. And I don't really like the term new normal, but do we move to a new normal within Florida, or more broadly after this based on some of the information that we're able to provide. So we are both researchers and extension professionals. So at the same time, when I say we would like to get some research outputs, we would obviously like to broadcast this information and get it out beyond something like an academic journal in order to inform decision making at the local level, the state level, and the federal level.
Krista, I believe there was another question that you wanted to answer live.
Yes, so Gulshan O'Neill actually asked, if there are plans to prioritize farm workers for COVID-19 vaccination, and then what are the attitudes towards the vaccine among workers, and do we have any insights about the vaccination issue? So I will say that this particular team is probably not the ones that are going to answer that, but I know that there's a large effort with both the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services, as well as several faculty members at UF-IFAS to work on some of these issues. So I would say to direct those questions to them. We did not cover farm workers as a group within this survey yet, so that's the only reason that I can't answer that, but we do have several faculty members also within the PI Center with UF-IFAS that are looking at these attitudes towards vaccination. And they may have covered some of the farm worker groups, but they're also looking at attitudes towards vaccination across several different populations.
Krista, another point of view in regard to the vaccine itself is that there is a view that it's not a preventive, that it will merely lessen the impact of COVID-19 if one were to contract it. On the other hand, there are people that view it as a preventive. We don't even know the effectiveness of the vaccine, yet we're trying to hypothesize the future on the presence of a vaccine without even actually knowing what the real consequences are.
Yep. So I hate to not answer a question, but I would leave that to the epidemiologists and those that are working with FDACS on that issue.
But it does impact human behavior, though, and consumption patterns and what people do.
Mm-hmm.
I would say that's other question is along those same lines of just staffing regarding farm workers. I don't know where we are in the state as far as the farm worker population, the migrant population, but yeah, I don't know if this is a question that was captured in your survey at this point.
Yeah, so I would say we captured it more on the quantitative survey probably than in the interviews, though others, if it came up in your interviews, please speak up.
Krista, we did capture some of it, certainly within the citrus part, because most of our citrus harvest is as is vegetables, it's all labor intensive, and 90% of the citrus that's being harvested is by H-2A workers, and they live in housing. That's a challenge under COVID conditions. They drive buses or ride in buses that are in challenge within COVID conditions. And when we were chatting with these folks back in, or the growers and even some harvesters as well, back in the July, August timeframe, they were already making plans on how to adjust their housing as well as their buses to ensure that they could try to have some social distancing both in the house as well as on the bus. So those steps are being implemented now. Now, how good they're going to be is yet to be determined, because folks are just not coming back. But overall, I think there was a question before about the exposure of COVID. Do not have good information on the harvesting side yet, but certainly within the ranks of the production facilities, it was rather minimal. It was more of a concern and a protection mode. So, the operations were very proactive about masking up and wearing PPE. One grower had all those people tested. If someone was exposed to it, then they were quarantined or asked not to be at work. So I think there was a lot of concern during the season, toward the end of the season, about how to keep this thing down. But most of the concern was about this upcoming season, how to contain it and how to live with it as best as they can without major infection rates.
And I'll ask Jean if Jean is able to speak to some of the training that's going on with regard to these issues.
Now, we've done several programs for agricultural employers, across the state and farm labor contractors. And we've had over 800 people attend those sessions. And it's basically a 2-hour session that goes over CDC guidance for agricultural employers and what precautions to take and what things you can do. And I agree with Fritz. I'm seeing, growers compared to the general population. I see more masks on farms than I do in Walmart and a place like LaBelle. People are socially distancing, they're managing their crews different, they're keeping their crews in smaller cohorts that don't mingle across larger numbers. They're redesigning lunch and break facilities so that people can social distance, often with plexiglass barriers in between people at the lunch tables. And even seeing some robotic temperature takers where when you walk onto the farm, there's basically, it looks like a small iPad, and you position your face in front of it. It takes your temperature, and if you have a temperature, it signals the supervisor. And if you're not wearing a mask, it scolds you and tells you to put your mask on. So growers are doing a lot. They really depend on their workers. I think one of the things we have seen, though, Chris, is some misinformation. There have been definite hotspots in some of the communities where farm labor is housed, places like Immokalee, Belglade. But I would submit that it's not necessarily that the farm workers are the cause of those hotspots. These are communities where what I would call your lower tier laborers that do landscaping, that do restaurant work, that do hotel work, that, cut lawns and whatnot, they congregate, they tend to live together in, close quarters, they tend to be less educated. And we're seeing hotspots, and it's probably more of a result of poverty and, the situation in which these folks live in places like Immokalee than the fact that they're farm workers or some other kind of worker.
We have a question that was answered via text, but I think could actually be expanded upon. If Laura, you might have more to say about it. How will the data collected help inform industry or policy long-term after the pandemic is over? And I also feel like other folks might have something to add to that as well.
Thank you. I think the goal, of course, is to share best practice amongst the different segments of the agricultural business supply chain. So to learn from each other, each entity had to respond to this pandemic, change strategy, change processes, change distributions, change customers. And so to be able to share that information on what worked and potentially what didn't work, on a broader scale to people in the industry so that we can look at modifications going forward. Because even though this was a unique experience, whatever we learn can benefit us in all risk management going forward. All right, come on, the rest of you chime in.
I was going to say, I'll just add that, oftentimes I'm asked about, what should a policymaker do or what should a decision maker do? And it's not my job to decide for them, right? But our job is to provide information and to provide insights on that information so that they can best make those decisions. And I would say that's definitely our goal here.
Yeah, I would add to what Laura said as well, because we can examine the data. We're collecting data in the same manner in stories throughout the state at many different facets of the food system, as well as spatially and temporally. So over time, as well as the different jurisdictions within the state. And we can get some really good data back about what worked, what didn't, what policy decisions worked, what didn't, how human behavior changed even in different areas based on how things were managed. So these stories are kind of can be used in multiple different ways to help inform all of us to manage risk in the future.
Indeed, there have been sectors, as we know, that have flourished due to the pandemic. Citrus sales are up and so on. Consumers recognize the potentially vitamin nutrients and so on that come from various crops and so on. Consumers are learning, and it's changed, that their patterns of behavior have changed. And so it's not all necessarily negative, but we have to recognize where the good is, where the bad is, and where there is no real impact. That's why I look at the behavioral aspects of this, how people perceive the various crops and the sundries and so on that are produced. Many are very, very good for them.
I think what the exercise also is telling us that there are differences between sectors, and it's good to get these stories out. And I want to get Chris Pravat to jump in here, because it's interesting to look at citrus processing and see the lack of effect that COVID had on citrus processing. But I think Chris would have a different story in terms of beef and other meat product processing. So Chris,
yeah, COVID really turned things over on us pretty quickly in the beef cattle industry, where the majority of our packing plants are in the Midwest, Southern Plains, Northern Plains. And right now we're actually having our second dose of some of the impacts that COVID's had on us, because our workers are so skilled in meat packing plants that they cannot be easily replaced. So while there may have been, high unemployment and jobs available at these meat packing plants, when someone went out with COVID, you couldn't just stick someone that isn't skilled in meat cutting and moving things around in a meat plant. You couldn't just stick them in. So who really got hurt on our side is our Florida cattle producers and cattle producers across the United States that didn't have the finished product to sell like we purchase as consumers from the grocery stores, but those that had the raw product cattle, they easily saw a 30% decline in prices last spring due to those impacts in the meat packing plants. And we're seeing a little bit of a resurgence there in terms of COVID getting in those plants, reducing some harvest efficiencies. We're still not back to normal in terms of harvesting cattle. We're still 1 million head behind where we were in 2019 here in 2020. So we're nowhere near close to normal, and we're beginning to deal with the second round of impacts. So,
Chris, how do you see the potential moving away from reliance on the 4 major packers and seeing more so-called processing at the local level? Could that be an unintended consequence that has actually come out of the COVID-19 issue?
Absolutely. So one of the things we're seeing is a resurgence in terms of smaller packing facilities around the United States, doing a little bit more in terms of local. It'll be small percentage of what we do, but there will be more options, more opportunities for people to market locally and provide some products to our local consumers that the cost of production again will be higher, but another point, just going back to those larger packing plants, one thing that they've begun adopting is really increasing the amount of robotics that are in these meat packing plants to potentially reduce some of the reliance on those skilled labor. So whenever we do have an outbreak like we have today, they're not as reliant because there is more technology being used in the plant.
Additionally, the 4 major packers do pick up economies of scale, and as we move to local production, we lose economies of scale. We just have to weigh the pros and cons, though. But I can see a lot of innovation occurring as pipelines and channels begin to shift and change. I think these are all opportunities and are open to future research.
Yeah, the one thing I'd add to that was we saw the majority of the packing issues were located at the largest plants, the medium-sized plants that we do have a few in the Southeast. We did not have these substantial issues that we had in those large packing plants out in Nebraska and Colorado and Kansas. So
I'd
So I
like to get
Uh,
Colleen involved in this discussion because I think that dairy had a similar kind of, you can't really do the direct to consumer deal with dairy either. So Colleen, do you have anything to
Thank you, Kristen. I was actually typing a response to the research one, and if we get to that question, I'll chime in. But that was something that came up in the dairy industry when they saw tankers of milk being dumped. People question, why can't you just give that away, or why can't people come get it? And there are a lot of industries, and dairy is certainly one of them, that is highly regulated, and it goes through processes for safety to make sure that it is safe for consumers. So pasteurization and testing takes place before it goes on the shelf. So while no one, wanted to see that hard-earned, milk go on the ground or down the drain, whatever the case was, there just wasn't an effective way. And if you've ever heard the phrase like drinking from a water hose, the amount of milk that was being, dumped out there, just, unless it is hooked up to those processes at the processing plant, there's just not really an effective way to handle that. We did kind of have a, silver lining. There were a couple processors who were able to increase production and get production straight to the consumer, but it's a really a long process for permitting to sell grade A milk in the state of Florida and across the country. It wasn't just here that you saw that happened, all over the country.
Colleen, I will come back to you on that research question as well, but I'd like to ask Jen Hagan to talk a little bit about this, the food safety and the local food awareness.
Thanks, Krista, and hi, everyone. I just wanted to mention that one of the silver linings that we're seeing coming out of COVID has been the positive impact on the handling and food safety elements across the board when it comes to food systems. People with COVID are becoming much more aware of how bacteria and viruses are transferred, how a lot of it has to do with our personal hygiene, how we handle food. So in regards to food safety in some of these food retail, fast food outlets, restaurants, entrepreneurship, farmer market type situations, a lot of folks are not only taking extra precaution due to COVID, but they're linking those extra precautions to food safety measures and using best management handling practices in these different arenas. So I would say one of the things to note is that these restaurants and these food retail establishments now are incredibly trying to sanitize and to clean and be very proactive. So these spaces now are becoming some of the cleanest that we've seen in years from a food safety perspective in regards to the personal handling and processing of humans in that environment. So the participants in these food systems, where in the past could have not knowingly contaminated food, for instance, are going above and beyond because of the heightened education due to COVID. So that is one of the silver linings that we are seeing across local food systems.
And Jen, just in case there's one more question in the chat box related to small animal farmers and their access to small capacity slaughterhouses and packers. So I don't know if either yourself or Chris could handle that question.
Well, access, I mean, Chris, I think you can come in and perhaps David as well. But one of those, the challenges in this environment is definitely access to these small packing and processing facilities. And that's something that we had as a barrier even prior to COVID. So I don't know if Chris and David can mention that a little bit more from the ag side of it. But for food entrepreneurship, also most of the food needing to be handled in a commercial licensed food establishment furthers some of the food safety in the commercial kitchen.
I can chime in on the marketing standpoint because I see potential for branded beef. There would be ranchers that could come up with certain cow bullet combinations where the meat would be absolutely superlative. If it went through a small packing operation locally, cut back on transportation costs, you could brand your beef. You would have it all identified and so on. I know there's a trending toward organic beef, but that's kind of a misnomer in that regard, though, because the things that we give cattle in a lot of cases and really take away from the so-called organic nature, though. But I see again unintended consequences and some positives in this regard. Maybe those will be exploited.
Hey, Chris, do you want to go first, or you're all right with me going first?
Go ahead. You're good.
All right. I think, as Chris alluded to earlier, it's a question of scale and cost. These processing facilities are very heavily regulated obviously for food safety concerns. And to have that come through a small processing facility, although with COVID, localized food systems and the resilience that they offer has definitely been highlighted, because a lot of local food systems have really increased their resilience as well as their awareness through this. But for local processing, it's a very difficult. In the best of times, small animals and beef, raising them is a break even. And if you're really good at it, you can make a little money. But having a small processing facility that's localized is going to be very high priced and not available to a wider community. It'll be very specific to who it targets for consumption.
There'd probably be an expectation too for branded beef that one indeed would pay more because you know exactly what you're getting in regard to taste and marbling, fat content, and all of that. So I know it doesn't have economies of scales and issues. But there may be segments that might be highly predisposed toward it, and a rancher indeed could look for higher returns.
The other thing I'd add to the question particularly was that there's been a push for a little bit of changing in terms of legislation through Congress, that they've put forth several acts that haven't really been moved forward to change the regulations for state processed facilities. So those that are not USDA certified, and that would provide additional access for small farms to market their products individually to consumers. The majority of our packing facilities, small packing facilities in the state of Florida, are state certified facilities, not USDA certified facilities. There is a move to get more online for USDA certified that we've seen since March. Big push there. But right now it's just not really not moving forward on that front.
On a similar note, I think that Eli perhaps can talk about sort of the logistics of making these sort of things happen. Just supply chain wide, we've had I don't know, everything kind of went crazy for a minute there. So I'm sure, Eli, you have some insights on how what the supply chain has learned out of this.
Yes, we learned that the effect of the COVID-19 has been very uneven in the supply chain. Supply chain is very complex links of different activities and processes. So in this particular case of the cattle slaughterhouse, transport cost would be an important factor. I'm not familiar with the options that we would have outside the state, but the cost of transportation in the current environment is very unpredictable. So there is a lot of demand, and the fact that you cannot find carriers may adversely impact plans for the short term. So the long term is viable, but not in the short term.
I think it also, Shalish, she was talking in generalizations about the logistics response to COVID. So not just strictly with cattle, but overall.
Yeah, the overall is uncertainty. We are 7 months into this COVID-19. The uncertainty we had from the beginning is still here. There was a lot of, let's say, optimism with the vaccine that came into the market. But now we see that we have problems with the supply chain of the vaccine. So think tank industry is really revising the forecast for 2021. So I think we were a bit optimistic in removing the uncertainty of the supply chain in terms of planning. But now what we get is more uncertainty in a different way. So prices will be a little bit unstable. Shortages, some links of supply chain, some raw materials. The other one, we might have oversupply. Is affecting air carriers, railroads, waterways in different ways. So it's a short-term spot market decision. It's the best that I heard so far is a very short-term contract. In terms of lead time, it has increased as well because of the CDC compliance we have to go through. Like was said here before, all the measurements, measures and processes that have to be created for the implementation of sanitation, distances in the workplace is adding to that relation between buyers and suppliers, increasing lead time throughout the supply chain. So this effect might stay here to the end of next year with a vaccine in place. Because again, there is a lot of uncertainty the effect of the vaccine will have on the entire supply chain.
That was specifically what I was asking about, just kind of a general overview. So okay. I want to return to another question that was answered via text. Colleen, you had answered about the research and any interruptions that were happening there. And, you know, with the dairy industry, obviously, you said everyone's been able to kind of make adjustments. So can you explain a little bit more about that?
So from the other responses, it looks like it was really industry specific. In the dairy industry, a lot of the research that was going on at the time was specific to groups of animals that you know, kind of had to be done, or that funding would be lost, and they would move on, you know, in their food supply chain into the beef industry eventually. So there were a lot of cases of dairy research that continued. The researchers had to adjust. They had to come down in separate vehicles. So it really increased the cost of the research if they had to have, you know, 2 or 3 rental vehicles instead of just, you know, instead of just one to ride together. But they were able to come down and wear masks and complete some of those time sensitive projects. And I think that, you know, that might have been the difference if it wasn't a time sensitive and deemed, you know, essential to get it done without that information being lost. You know, maybe those things were put on hold, but quite a bit of research in the dairy industry continued. I also know there were some biological control with some bugs that are being used to control Brazilian pepper spread, and that research continued. Again, it just continued in smaller groups and with precautions, mask and hand sanitizer and people social distancing and people not riding together in vehicles. So it continued with some precautions, but I know that there were quite a few areas where research was canceled and potentially data was lost.
if I might add, here at our research station at Southwest Florida, we, especially with the vegetable crops, because these are short-term crops that, you know, are in the ground for 50 to 80 days. And we were basically shut down for about 2 months in March and April by the university administration, and, you know, prohibited anything, you know, in terms of data collection. And, you know, so a lot of our young scientists lost basically 6 months worth of research, which was quite a crushing blow, you know, especially to a non-tenured faculty that's, you know, 1 or 2 years on the job trying to, you know, put together a research portfolio, and to lose that amount of time was not very good.
We are nearing the end of our time here. Is there any other burning questions anyone has?
Yeah, I'll just mention a couple other things. As we said, this is ongoing, and now that the economic stimulus is kind of, well, paused or wrapped up briefly, that's going to definitely offer some feedback within the economy as well as the food supply, the food system and the food chain. So, you know, and I also wanted to just focus on the partnership with FGCU and potentially FAMU in the next few weeks. This has been great to work together with FGCU. I'm in Lee County, so they're kind of our local university, and to have this kind of between two institutions has been really enjoyable, and we've been able to work really well together. And I just wanted to thank Fritz for all of his time, and Krista and all of everybody that's participated on this.
Great, and I'll just wrap up reminding everybody that, like David said, this is ongoing, and as I mentioned before, we're not yet to the data analysis step, so we're sharing initial impressions that are anecdotal in nature at this point, and should not be considered. You know, if we heard from 3 producers, 3 other producers might have said something completely opposite. So not necessarily take it with a grain of salt, but just remember that this is anecdotal evidence and initial impressions, and we hope to have some more firm insights after we get through that data analysis step. And again, we would welcome any others that want to contribute. Often when we say that we're doing research on impacts, they think we only want to hear about negative impacts, but like Stuart mentioned before, we absolutely want to hear about the good, the bad, the ugly, and if you did fantastic throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, that's important information to collect as well. So.
All right, with that, we are right at time. So thank you all for attending today. Again, if you need any information from any of these folks on the screen, if you have their email addresses, obviously you can contact them. If not, my email is in the chat right now, and I can connect you with them. And I also will have the recording if you would like that. Thank you all.